Today on Perspectives, we're talking with Jonathan Yarmis about all things Microsoft, and in particular, all things Ballmer. That's Steve Ballmer, the CEO of Microsoft, who just recently announced that he will not be repeating his tenure next year. Jonathan, you know Steve Ballmer personally.
That is correct. I've known the man for 26 years now.
Here's a guy that may have lost Microsoft's mojo. How do you view the tenure of Steve Ballmer at Microsoft?
I think it's convenient to dump on him, and that much of the criticism that is being laid on him is just real easy, cheap shots, because I think the guy was in a very interesting position. You know, hindsight being 2020, what people are saying is, gee, he took this company something on the order from a revenue perspective. Let's ignore market cap, but a revenue perspective over 3x by transforming it into a very successful enterprise company, even while retaining its consumer bent. In fact, I don't want to sound like a Steve Ballmer apologist, because I'm not. There are a whole bunch of things that I think Microsoft could have done better. But I made the observation the day he left that, Clayton Christensen's Innovator's dilemma is a harsh mistress. And it's real easy to say, gee, here's what Microsoft should have done. Let me make two observations about that, though. Number one, let's say 7 years ago, Steve Ballmer stood up and said, this mobile stuff is going to be really important, and this cloud stuff is going to be really important. So what I today am announcing is we, Microsoft, really need to go attack our business. We want to bring out Microsoft Office for every possible operating system. So we're going to kill the Office revenue stream. And we're going to go after this cloud-based stuff, because who needs on-premises computing? So let's go kill Windows, kill SQL Server. We need to position ourselves well for cloud-based computing. If he had made that announcement, before he completed the announcement, the shareholders' lawsuits would have been filed. The board would have fired him summarily and said, no. We understand these things are going to be important, but we can't give up on that stuff right now. Number two, we give credit to Apple for all of this innovation, but I would argue that Microsoft's failures actually set the stage for Apple's success. Number one, tablets. I carried a Windows tablet in 2001. We're talking, 6, 7, 10 years before the iPad, before the iPhone. Now the operating environment was kludgy at best, but Microsoft was way too early for the market. Perhaps more importantly, Apple didn't invent the smartphone. There were several others beforehand, and Apple had a very interesting opportunity to learn from Microsoft's mistakes. Microsoft actually embarked on an interesting strategy where they said, we need a mobile computing platform and not just be the playthings of the carriers whose backwards mindsets have, stifled innovation here in North America for a long time. So Microsoft went to the carriers and said, here, we've got this smartphone platform. And what the carriers did was they said, wow, that sounds really great, and we'd love to do it if you do X and Y and Z and A and B and C. And by the time Microsoft came out with a Windows mobile platform that satisfied the carriers, it satisfied the carriers and no one else. Apple, having learned from this, when they came forth with their smartphone platform, this thing is really good, and we're not going to let you muck with it at all. And we know it's so good, one of you is going to finally capitulate and do it our way. And having learned from the mistakes of Microsoft, having seen the obvious problems of the carriers, Apple said, no compromises, and the rest, as they say, is history. So it's convenient at this point to say Steve screwed up, but I think the track record of both extending the existing revenue streams as well as trying to innovate against that innovator's dilemma, harsh mistress, are actually a pretty decent legacy.
That's a great point about the innovator's dilemma. Could Steve Ballmer have done anything better or different with Microsoft that would have really propelled them into the stratosphere? I'm not sure that the answer there is yes.
I think what they've done this is an industry that's characterized by companies that end up, roadkill on the side of industry change. And so Microsoft, which started fundamentally as a standalone PC company, we remember the years of Novell and Year of the LAN, and somehow Microsoft evolved into being a client server player as that played out. Then, having established a dominant role in client server, along came the internet, and whether it was exploitation of monopoly position, or adequately responding to a changing technological environment, and the answer is certainly elements of both of those. They emerged a player in the internet era, and here they are, still struggling in the mobile and cloud era, but we're not prepared to declare them dead. Maybe certain their initiatives are challenged and will go no further, but they're credible players again in an industry transformation, and that's almost unheard of in technology. Where look at what happened. IBM led the mainframe era, and they sold off their PC division. HP is struggling, and Dell is trying to take itself private to do God knows what, to respond to things that it totally missed. You can say Microsoft didn't do things aggressively enough or what have you, but it's not like they missed these things. They were there early with incomplete efforts, but it's not like they missed them. And that's rare in a technology company. And I'm not prepared to write them off yet. I'm certainly, don't confuse me for, a Windows Phone enthusiast, not by any stretch of the imagination, but they've done a pretty good job there. They've done something that's not a Me Too, and the whole design language of Windows Phone, Windows 8 is something that you're seeing increasingly on websites, and Apple finds itself, and Google as well, but Apple particularly finds itself in the rare position of actually having to catch up on an interface.
Steve Ballmer is out. We're not quite sure who's in yet at this point. If you had to look back at Steve Ballmer's tenure, what are 3 things that you think he did really well?
I think number one, he actually, survived the transition from Bill Gates. I mean, think about that one. How many times, when an icon steps down, who wants to be next? There are a whole bunch of, who followed Bear Bryant as the coach of Alabama? I have no idea, but it was probably just a year or two. He lost the job, and then who followed Vince Lombardi? All of these things. Following a legend is a really tough thing to do.
Oh, ask Cook at Apple.
Yeah, or ask who was it? The succession. John Scully and Michael, God, I forget, his name now, but there were the successors to Jobs the first time around. It's not easy to do. So I think one, the fact that he survived and put his imprint on the company, number one. Number two, the successful transition from a consumer company to an enterprise company. And there are all sorts of pluses and minuses, that come along with that, but he certainly was able to transition the company's business model in a profound and interesting way, from selling consumer packaged software to licensed software generally to enterprises, and all the, benefits and stability and predictability that came along with that. And then 3, we've all seen in the last couple of days the developers, kind of video ad nauseum, but like the guy or hate the guy, the man's passion was without equal, so that's amazing. And then, one thing people didn't see of him, and I didn't get to see it a lot, but I saw it a few times and heard it quite frequently. The guy had, Microsoft is a diverse and large business, and the man had a deep understanding of what was going on in that business. You go talk to mid-level product managers who do nothing but work on their product all day, and they'd go into a review with Ballmer, and he would inevitably find the hole in their business model, or he'd have better command of the numbers in their spreadsheet than they did. So the man had a remarkable grasp on a far-flung business, in a way that I've not heard talked of as other executives. So I think it's a guy who understood his business and had a deep and abiding passion. He's one of the, he's not as rich as Gates, but he's one of the, 100 richest guys in the world, and he works harder than you and me combined.
Those are some great points about Microsoft and what Ballmer did well. There are those who might say, yeah, he made the transition from Bill Gates, but at the same time, would that transition have been possible if Bill Gates hadn't gone, full humanitarian in his efforts there? I mean, Bill really did walk away from the business at a certain point, and I think part of that was for his own, self-interest, but also part of it to give, Ballmer the room and the space that he needed to have within Microsoft.
Yeah, and I think, Bill saw a bigger calling, and Bill and Melinda both, she deserves some of the credit too, but, they saw a bigger calling, and Steve, in the meantime, the consummate sales guy, bled Microsoft and said, no, I'm going to stay here and do this because this is the most interesting and important thing I can do.
Jonathan, lay out for me 3 things that you think Ballmer has missed over his tenure.
I'd say number one, I think in the whole mobile device thing, that capitulating to the carriers was was a mistake. That, at some point he should have said, either we do it our way or we're just not going to do it. Because by capitulating to the carriers, they left themselves in a terrible strategic position.
Do you think that Microsoft today would be better served if they have jumped into the phone manufacturing business?
Yes. If they had said, the heck with you guys, we're going to do it our way, whatever that means. There's one more, and I think let's leave it at that because it's a big one. We talked about this, Microsoft, and when I first started covering Microsoft as an analyst in 1987, they were the champion of the end user. They went and said, we're going to equip you end users with the tools and technologies that enable you to thumb your nose at the IT organization. Somewhere along the way, Microsoft evolved, and step 2 of that evolution was, we're still going to satisfy the end user, but we're now going to placate IT. We're going to do enough to make our devices and applications and so on be good citizens in a corporate environment so that we can empower the end users and, oh, by the way, extend their reach and impact and functionality in the enterprise. Somewhere along the way, I think Ballmer lost sight of that end user, that the enterprise became so lucrative that they said, okay, we're going to now please IT and merely placate the user. And of all, you look at the companies that, who in the world should have seen this consumerization of IT come along and be well prepared to capitalize on it. Microsoft, under the old vision, and, I won't say Gates would have seen this one coming because, he certainly kept his fingerprints on the company, and has bought off on the vision as chairman of the board and so on. But Microsoft lost its way and became an enterprise company at, in some ways, exactly the wrong time to be an enterprise company. They had the roots in the consumer. They, of all people, could have walked that consumerization path, and the fact that they didn't do that, I think, that's perhaps the biggest failing in my mind of Steve Ballmer. He turned it into a very successful enterprise company, but didn't make it be a consumer enterprise company with all the wealth and opportunity that would have afforded them.
Right after the announcement from Ballmer, you and I had some great back and forth conversations about what was actually taking place here. I really like to know, What do you think is next for Microsoft? What do they need to do next to survive the Ballmer to the next guy transition?
Yeah, well, there are really two things that got to go all in on, and one of them is this notion: are they a devices and services company? Because at this point they're in an uncomfortable in between position where in some instances they are, some instances they're not. It's like they've got to decide that they're going to go all in on the devices and services strategy and go accelerate that, because they've got two credible competitors in Apple and Google who are advancing in that direction in a variety of fronts. And so, if the next CEO doesn't accelerate that, then this transition came at a bad period of time. The second thing, and this is just one of those difficult things that in some ways has gotten lost in the Ballmer resignation situation. He, as perhaps his last notable act, put in place this radical reorganization within the company. And it's one of those things that, if you don't know Microsoft, it's been as political a viper pit as any large company has ever been. And they, one of the things when you're a quasi-monopolist, you can do those kinds of things. Your biggest competition comes internally because, frankly, the external challenges to monopolists are few and far between. So Microsoft had this, dare I use the word, poisonous culture that they, finally took some steps to go resolve with this organization restructuring, which was probably a necessary precursor to delivering on the devices and services vision. Now we've got this awkward period where the next CEO isn't in place, and thus you're trying to evolve an organization into a new structure with a lame duck leader. And watching how this one plays out will be really fascinating. There are all sorts of things, from a tactical day-to-day operation of, how the business goes forward, that could be terrible situations, in the absence of strong direction from the top. So he said he'd resign within a year. I hope John Thompson and the search committee are working really, really quickly to get the next person in place, because I think if they don't do that, the organizational challenges will tear it apart and compromise its ability to deliver on the vision.
Jonathan, as always, phenomenal time having a conversation with you.
Fred, never enough.
Let's circle back in a few weeks, and let's talk some more Microsoft here, and start to map out a Steve Ballmer exile tracker, if you will.
And handicap the CEO candidates.
You got it. Jonathan, thank you very much. Looking forward to having you back on Perspectives again.